Hello and welcome to the Data for Subscriptions podcast. This time around, a live session. And I'm your host, Berat Bonian, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming Igor Stenmark to the show. Igor, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Bedad. Appreciate it.
Igor, you're the co-founder and managing partner at MGI Research. So we're going to be able to lean towards you today, amongst others, with your unbiased and candid view of the market. And our focus, of course, is to really dig deep into usage-based billing and the complexities associated with it.
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to this dialogue. And just before we get going, just want to mention to everybody who logs on now, you are welcome to input your questions into the chat field, and we'll make sure to pick them up along the way. And we'll also make sure that there's time at the end for additional questions and answers. But feel free just to add them in, and we'll pick them up. All right, Igor, we let's just set the base first. What do we mean by usage billing?
So usage billing is basically ability of a company to charge its customers based on the amount of service they consume. So it could be how much storage is consumed, how much bandwidth is consumed, how many API calls they made, so that kind of stuff. So think about the old telephone billing systems, which would be, billing would be based on number of minutes um, or any messages you send.
Yep. If we speak about the drivers for adoption, because we've seen this now increasingly being a term that has popped up in the industry in the last 2 years, what would you say are the primary drivers for moving towards usage-based billing?
I think one of the key drivers for this is really kind of a sense that usage based models really help align the economic interests of the actual customers and the seller. So basically saying if you use more, you pay more. If you use less, you pay less. So that's kind of the theory behind it. There's been kind of as well as additional increased supply of capability in this area. We see more people trying to build this internally in some cases. We see more startups that have come to market offering this capability to target markets that previously were not consumers of usage-based business models. So it's kind of multiple forces that are propelling this forward at this point. But I think the basic argument that people make, at least theoretically, is that this helps align the economic interests.
And do you agree with that practically that it does?
Um, as it is often the case, practical adoption and practical use can be very different. So people are used to standardized subscription-based models where they pay a fixed fee per month per seat. When you have usage, you can do very well as a seller, but also you give up some degree of predictability, and that can cause unexpected outcomes. I'll give you an example. We have a client firm that is in the online ticketing business. They sell tickets to various concerts, and basically their business is doing great. Everything is usage based. They sell APIs to ticket sales, but none of the investors have been able to value the company and commit to funding. So in the meantime, they are rolling on their own. So I think reality is much more complicated typically than what the theory portrays.
But what we can summarize is that what usage-based models do is that it gives you additional tools in your pricing framework. So if you go from basic flat fee subscriptions, you at least have the options of adding additional variables. And I know you speak about it quite often yourself, is that there could be you know, base commitment in terms of a certain fee, and then on top of it, you have a number of pay as you go or consumption based, for example. We typically refer to that in the industry as like hybrid pricing, for example, right?
Yeah, that's certainly one very real possibility. I think we few companies really start right away with usage-based pricing in their business models. There are a few, like the client example I shared previously, but most companies they start with a basic subscription, and then we at some point we reach a level of saturation where they signed up pretty much everybody in their target market, and the model goes flat with some degree of add-ons and cancellations and so on. So people begin to think, how do I grow beyond that plateau? What do I have to do to escape? What's my second escape velocity here? And we start thinking about usage, where we start thinking about the fact that maybe the basic subscription only covers a certain amount of content or material or capability, and anything that's extra to that should be priced through either usage or some sort of a hybrid model. Could be usage with tiers, could be usage with minimum commitments, can be prepaid or postpaid. So usage gives businesses a lot of optionality, a lot of capability that they don't necessarily get with a flat monthly price subscription. So it really opens up a lot of potential markets. Opens up markets that maybe before were not reachable, where a customer will say, "I can't afford to pay, $2,000 per seat per month, but if you give me usage-based pricing, I can try it for 6 months and see if my people get into it. And if they do, then we can renegotiate that in a year and see where we end up." So it really is a lot of opportunity with usage billing.
Gotcha. Let's talk about the common challenges with getting started. You already mentioned one of the challenges we could say, but that necessarily is not to get started, but it's the predictability that you kind of have to negotiate with. But let's talk about the common challenges when people want to get started with usage based. What would you say are those ones?
I think one of the most important things that companies need to plan for is to have a clear understanding of what pricing models we're going to deploy, what's the pricing complexity, and what is the data situation, what is the data complexity and data cleanliness. Um, where is a it's with usage billing is not one size fits all. You can have a variety, almost think of it as a spectrum of complexity. So where on that spectrum of complexity does your business really position? Are you okay doing a very simple basic usage feed once a month, one batch file from a single source, everything looks the same? Okay, that's fairly easy to do. Most products today can handle that. Versus you want to do something that will measure your consumption in real time or quick time and create updates to account statements in real time as well, while simultaneously really accepting data from variety of incompatible data sources. So there's really a big distance between the first example I gave you versus somebody's trying to do real-time usage-based billing based on variety of data sources in real time. So different levels of technology are required. Underneath all that, there has to be a singular focus on data, because data in most organizations is not 100% clean. And we're doing a study right now, and we found that basically, if you have 0.1% of your data that's dirty in various forms, misaligned, missing data, out of sync, that can lead to about 1% revenue leakage. So it's about 10 to 1. And that's very significant. If you're running, a $10 million business, that's maybe an amount you can tolerate. But if you're running a billion, 5 billion, $20 billion organization, and you have even 1% revenue leakage, which is really well below where the industry benchmarks are, which are typically between 3 to 7%. When 1% revenue leakage is a very meaningful number. It can sway a quarter, can change your results significantly in fortunes. So I think people need to be really prepared for the data problem, really understand where's data going to come from, um, design a system that will combine different data sources if we need to be in real time, how a cleaning is going to go, how consolidation is going to go, how you're going to handle it and do it in a persistent manner, as opposed to trying to sort of, filter your data once and hope for the best afterwards.
Thank you. Want to just double click on that focus on data that you mentioned. How come, in your experience, it is so that businesses, and we've come across this, both of us, businesses that are literally turning around billions in revenue, are still sitting with some of these data challenges and issues? How come this is the case, Igor? Is it due to lack of competence, awareness, or overbelief in certain existing processes? What is the main driver or cause?
I think most companies, even best run companies with really a very solid IT infrastructure and really competent teams, um, focus on data is often, we find, that's an afterthought.
Okay.
It it's really attended to once something begins to fall down, once we realize that something is not working right. It's very often not a proactive exercise, and it's not a continuous exercise. So, and that's what it needs to be. It needs to be kind of done in advance, proactively, on a continuous basis. Um, I see companies that have huge amounts of data and more data. The growth in data is huge. It far exceeds any growth in GDP or in revenue, and it's only accelerating. So companies are really challenged in that area, and especially if you have to then say to them, take what data you need. Let's say you're doing dynamic pricing and you want to take information about traffic, information about supply and demand, and combine it into one system so that you can have dynamic pricing and dynamic rating and billing. That's not easy to do. It requires specialized expertise. So we find that a lot of companies are unprepared for that. They attempt to do it on their own, uh, oftentimes with mixed success. They don't engage with professional organizations that do this for a living. So I would say that remains really a huge problem. As we
Right.
say here, dirty data kills, almost like cigarettes kill.
Yeah.
Um, and we're probably years away from a situation where this is going to be really meaningfully corrected.
Also, for everybody listening, so when you advise companies, Igor, what are the 2 to 3 things you can advise us all to lead with in terms of questions so we can self-diagnose ourselves, just given what you just described? How do you do it?
Well, as we discussed just a little bit earlier, understand your requirements. Where on a requirements spectrum, on a complexity spectrum, are you now? And where is your business going to be, not only now, but say 24, 36 months out? So if you're building some sort of a data bus to really bring information to usage-based pricing model or dynamic pricing, you need to understand what the competitive dimensions are in your business and your economic sector, and where do you need to be with what capability so that you are well positioned to compete in your space. That's number one. Number two, try to sort of not sort of understand what your data sources are. Where's data coming from? What is the growth in that data? What is the level of complexity in the data? What's the level of hygiene in that data? What kinds of things will you have to build and accommodate in order to process this data successfully? So we oftentimes point people to a basic issue of you're going to need storage. You're going to need variable storage. You may want to talk to your hyperscaler about how to store all this usage data or data that you feed into a dynamic pricing algorithm. Um, so that's a very important aspect of it as well. And the other thing we advise companies is really examine both organizationally and in terms of skills, do you have a right team in place? Even if you engage with an external partner that has expertise in this area, whether it's a software provider or a systems integrator, you will need some level of internal skill to manage this on a continuous basis. So don't assume that you can just hand off this problem to a software supplier or an SI and pray for the best. You'll need to invest into some internal resources. We've seen examples of usage billing being adopted now by relatively small companies, Series A, Series B companies, for fairly simple use cases where maybe it's a simple feed or a single real-time feed from one source, maybe two at the max. Um, Going beyond, and that you can do probably with limited level of resources and skill sets, but anything going beyond that, you're going to have to invest into people as well as tools.
Gotcha. Thank you. So first, understand your business requirements of today. Look 20 to 36 months ahead and what's needed, and then what capabilities that you need to basically be successful. Number two, understand where the data comes from and your sources. And number three, don't forget the skills and competence that you need also in-house still to be able to run this business, so to say.
Yep.
That's uh, that's very concrete. Thank you. I'm just going to add my perspective on number two, which is just very pragmatically and practically. If you do notice as a business that it takes you a fair bit of time to allocate the different data sources and the data records, that's an indication that that is not working to the satisfactory level that your business will require, which is something that we notice most of the times when we engage with customers, is that in fact, they might be able to actually capture the data, and most of the times they do, but it typically is fairly manual. And if you think about your first point, Igor, that where your business need to go and what capabilities you need much more agile and just automated fashion, not to mention the data cleanliness that you mentioned, to avoid dirty data. But this is very helpful. Thank you, Igor. I was thinking that we move over to more of the execution implementation side of things now. But before we do, we have some comments and questions as well. So I'm just going to take the first one. This is more of a statement, but it's related to when we spoke about pricing models and variations that you could have a few minutes ago. And as the note came up from Roy, thank you for your input. You could also have various packages of usage based models, also like 50 cents up per API up to 50, and then 40 cents between 50 and 100 API calls, and then 30 cents beyond. We might refer to this as like a tiered approach, where
Yeah,
you have some of a
it looks that
discount
way.
model on top. Do you want to expand or comment on this?
Yeah, this is a very common model, except in most cases, companies don't always charge 40 cents or 50 cents for API because people who are interested in this kind of stuff generally you're talking about buying packs of 100,000 a million API calls. That's the scale of it. So um, so a lot of times the actual each API call can be less than a penny. That's the kind of thing that will really stimulate consumption. So people will think, oh, it's 1/10 of a cent penny per API call, but then we get kind of their statement at the end of the month, and we realize that they far exceeded anything they planned. So you have to be careful about that with customers if that's what you are proposing to them, because um, clients generally, people in especially in IT environment don't get fired for spending a million or spending 10 million. They get rewarded if they spend 10 million and they predicted that, and they get fired if they have $1 million unexpected expense. So there needs to be a mechanism where you can proactively communicate to the client saying you are reaching 80% capacity in your prepaid or in your kind of a setup to do alerts when you reach certain level of consumption. So those are important things to consider.
So the next question, I'm going to actually bake it into one question I had myself. But if I go from my end, I kind of step into the question of um, tools that we need to have or implement to make sure we can achieve what we just discussed, Igor. So my first question is, there seems to be, if one looks at the market, there seems to be so that billing systems or billing providers are obviously claiming that you can do usage-based billing through or with the billing system. Is that the case or not? If you can just elaborate on it.
Yes. So in theory, in simplistic terms, yes, many billing software providers have mediation, rating capability, ability to operate in quick time or real time. In practical terms, um, it again depends on where you are on your spectrum of complexity. Um, I think the best billing products out there can handle a certain level of complexity and volume when it comes to mediation and rating. Um, and they tend to kind of have more difficulty as you go above that kind of a threshold where you say, I need to process, four or 500,000 events per second. I need to process up to n different incompatible data sources. You're basically asking those systems to create an orchestra from a bunch of soloists who've never played together. um, and so that can be a challenge with a certain level of risk involved in that. So it can work up to a certain point and probably work fairly well. But then if you have a more complex end of that spectrum, it becomes much more challenging, I think. So you kind of need to ask your billing supplier when they tell you that they support usage-based billing, show me, tell me, show me your references. I want to talk to them, ask them to see if their use case matches my use case. Show me how you would do dynamic pricing. Show me how you would do an audit. What's involved in that? And I don't want to be loading data and unloading data using ETL tools because that's an additional cost and it's not real time, it's all batch. So those are the kinds of things you need to engage in kind of to make sure that what the billing supplier can offer, which can be a solution, actually meets going to meet your requirements both now and in the near future.
Gotcha. I was meaning to ask you, because I know you speak about a litmus test that you do to kind of verify the claims that companies make, but you beat me to them. So I think that those factors that you mentioned in terms of check references and ask to be shown and proven how dynamic pricing is done, auditing, and the whole data management back end are extremely good points for anybody who is looking into this. Let's the question that we also had in the background that I was meaning to ask, to some extent, I believe you've already answered it, but if we put it on the screen here, Thomas, the question was specifically how scalable are usage billing systems and what considerations should business consider to ensure the system can adapt and change to business needs? I mean, to large extent, you've answered it, but if you want to have another take at it, please go ahead.
Mhm. Yeah. So billing systems can provide performance up to a certain level. Call it maybe, we've seen some recent benchmarks published by a number of vendors where we say if they can handle upwards to say a couple of 100,000 events per second. We have not yet seen actual kind of references. We our research is always based on field work, so we have to go out and validate some of those statements. But I think there's probably a number of areas where those requirements go well beyond that, 100 to 200,000 events per second. But also, I think with complexity of the data and growth in the data coming in, ability to manage the data on a dynamic basis, being able to consolidate when needed, create what's so-called golden billing record. Those are complex exercises, but it's not enough to just be able to say, I can feed a lot of data very quickly and it's a single level data. It's all very, very simple. Um, the other thing we also recommend to clients is to take a look at how we're going to use mediation capability in general beyond just the billing use case. There is increasingly interest in, especially in finance organizations, um, to utilize some sort of a data bus, data substrate to consolidate over data. Because right now, many of the finance processes, including billing, run on a batch basis. So they are running with a delay,
Hmm.
kind of a discrete approach as opposed to a continuous approach. Whereas many finance organizations increasingly want to know, where do I stand? What's my exposure? What's my foreign currency risk? A famous example we give is when, after the 2008 mortgage crisis globally, United States government took over General Motors in the U.S. And the person that they put in charge of it was a former private equity professional. And the very first question he asked was, "How much cash do we have on hand?" Seems like a simple question. It took 60 days to answer that question. So you don't want to be in that situation. You want to be able to answer it in, maybe not in real time, but in quick time. So that's another use case. So consider that as well as a sort of consideration.
Yep. You do research. You've already mentioned that, and I know that in your latest research, you say that 60% of the observed companies are already running usage based. So, can we just start by highlighting the demographics of who did you survey? Who were included?
Yeah, so we surveyed probably a few hundred companies and asked them, "Are you utilizing usage in some shape or form?" And 60% said yes. Interestingly enough, a lot of them have said that usage is not the only pricing model that they are utilizing. There's generally a spectrum of different pricing modalities, including hybrid. Um, and a lot of it, people, they see real time or quick time um, usage data as being absolutely critical to their initiative. Also, we found that a lot of the same companies are ones who exhibit high growth. So we're growing at 20% plus. So a few interesting data points came out of that study. And so we're continuing to run that. So more stuff should be coming out over the next few months.
If you break down those 60% and we bring it back to when you talked about that, there's a obviously a spectrum in terms of complexity from the one product, one batch that you're running all the way to the other end where you're running multiple products, multiple SKUs and real time. Can you give us a little bit of a feel for where these companies typically sit at the early stage, mid or late stage advanced? What's the
Yeah,
proportion?
it breaks down from what I've seen so far. It mostly breaks down by size. So the larger companies tend to have more complex, more volume of requirements. So we're kind of at the higher end of that complexity and volume dimension intersection. And with smaller companies, with more of a startups, Series A, Series B, generally have with simpler use cases. But in with few exceptions, we've seen a couple of companies, let's say in transportation, in logistics, one company that's leasing containers for ocean transportation. It's all real time, a lot of data, even though the company has only about 40 people, but they process a huge amount of data and huge amounts of revenue.
Gotcha. Let's talk about getting things to work at scale. You mentioned this several times as well, beyond complexity, which is one of the other vectors. Can you elaborate a little bit more so we all understand when you say getting it to work at scale, what that specifically means, and what are the risks if one oversees that aspect?
Yeah, very good question. So, what can scale mean in this context? So, scale could mean just volume of data you're processing. Scale could mean speed, being real time or quick time versus doing this in batch once a month or once in a billing cycle. Scale could mean how many different data sources you have. What is the conversion algorithm from the processing of how many records for call records, if you call them, in the old parlance of telecom, into a golden billing record? What's the scale of that? And how many interfaces do you need to put in place? How many external systems are going to be feeding the data? And how do you manage that whole complex? How do you make that sound like an orchestra with perfect pitch, as opposed to kind of a bunch of guys just playing in their own little corners here. So that's in very simplistic terms. That's kind of a definition of scalability. How do you get this to scale? Reporting, very important, and then ability, as I mentioned earlier, ability to generate um, an audit that is unambiguous and something that cannot be repudiated in any shape or form. That's another kind of definition of scalability. So at any point in time, a client may come back to you and say, yes, we consumed X number of units this month. We believe you, but we want to show our management and our auditors what we've done, and therefore we would like to see an audit of that. So we want to go back last month, maybe month before that, and take some samples of data and recreate the billing situation. So if there's no ambiguity about the fact that the billing, the calculations are absolutely correct 100% of the time.
Great, thank you. All right, so I want to move just into the final section since we've covered basically the all the way from the basics of what usage billing is with the examples to the range and spectrum of complexity, and then also here finally talking about where company stands as well as the actual question of scale. Where I want to end things a bit is if you would advise on what's best practice setup leaning towards your accumulated knowledge of all the different companies you've seen, all the mistakes that you've seen, what would be the guidance you have for everybody listening? What's a good setup? And I mean, from a systems and tools standpoint, to make sure that you set yourself up for success so you can grow and scale along the way.
Yeah, good question. When we encounter somebody who is brand new to this, or maybe they try to do it in house and realize this is more than they can chew. Our advice for them is to go have a conversation with a variety of suppliers. Go talk to a billing vendor, talk to mediation software suppliers, talk to systems integrators. Accumulate knowledge as rapidly as you can, and make sure you have a team internally that's going to absorb it, document it, and really kind of distill it into practical action items related to what you're going to do internally in your company. So that's one element of that. We focus their attention on storage and hyperscaling that storage and how we're going to handle it. Some companies are perfectly happy to do it internally in-house, and most companies nowadays opt to go to their cloud provider and have a discussion with them about how we're going to scale the storage mechanism for usage-based data. The other side of that is, again, going back to a comment I made earlier about understanding where you are competitively, where are the pricing approaches going in the next 24, 36 months. What does a competitive field look like? So are you going to need to offer just usage billing with tiering, prepaid versus postpaid, where technical considerations and business considerations for both? Are you going to use metering and measuring, not to do an invoice, but actually just measure level of engagement and usage? A good example would be you may have an unlimited data plan with your telecom provider, but guess what? They're still measuring you every hour of every day. And if you exceed a certain threshold, they'll slow you down. We kind of are forced to doing that. So understand kind of the pricing and business model complexity. Are you going to be offering dynamic pricing, for example? What does it take to support that? And then really have an understanding of complexity spectrum of your data. How many different data sources? Where do we come from? How stable? How clean? What kind of conversion? What kind of mediation is going to be required to support that? Those are kind of elemental items what you need to have in order to not guarantee success, but at least ensure that you're going in the right direction. So that's kind of our view on that.
Okay, gotcha. Let's take a question that just came in, which is related to the statement that you made in terms of how one would do dynamic pricing and how one would do audits. The question here is, what are some of the other questions you would ask a billing solution provider to determine the limitations of their mediation usage data layer capabilities?
Yeah, I would, always tell our clients to go ask for references, go get references, talk to them, understand their use case, and compare it to what you're trying to do. Yeah, I think that's the best practical way of getting a level of comfort, because generally this is a complex thing. So most companies don't want to go on a fishing expedition saying, let's install it and try it and see what happens. They want to have, before we even do it, they want to have a reasonable level of comfort that when they actually go set up a trial, that this is going to work, this is going to be a success. We don't want to be experimenting in something like that. So I would say generally go get your field data, talk to references or listen to reference calls, see what happened. Does it match your use case? Is your requirement set comparable in terms of scalability, complexity, being able to manage it, being able to audit the data coming in? So
Great. Thank you. Okay, I think that wraps it up for today. Igor, thank you so much for your time.
thank you for having
Greatly
me.
appreciate it. And thank you for everybody also signing in and joining in today for your questions and comments. Thank you so much, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.